J.D. Mitchell, he's been here a number of times before. He has a background in geology and engineering, and he's headed up his a ministry that he has used to produce a number of books on creation, and you're going to find his books and I think some DVDs back there as well that you might want to take a look at and see what is of special interest tonight will be the table of fossils and the replicas of fossils, which he'll talk about a bit towards the end of his talk. And I don't think any of those fossils are living. They're not going to jump off the table, are they? Don't expect to. Okay, so just watch out. Well, with that, JD, why don't you come up and share with us?
All right, thank you very much, Heinz. I think maybe what I should start with is just a short testimonial before we get into these living fossils. My specialty, I've been into creation science since 1984, and I guess, you can't know everything about creation science, so everybody just has to specialize in certain things. My specialties are creation engineering, biblical paleontology, and under that, dinosaurs and fossils, plus an emphasis on origins and worldview issues. So far as my testimony, I grew up in the church. Always was in the church, except when I went to college. Then I didn't have any time. I was too busy. But I did not believe the Bible was anything particularly better than a lot of other books I had in my library. It had some good stuff in it, but just, things that help you with your life. But since I understood that evolution and millions of years were true, since that's what all of my teachers had told me, then I understood that Genesis could not be correct, and if Genesis was not correct, if it was a bunch of myths or allegories, then the rest of the Bible was suspect as well. And I did not get much in the way of assistance from my pastors because they didn't want to talk about it, and so I went on until I was 40 years of age. I was still in the church, but I didn't put the Bible as being too important. We were in the church primarily because we had children, and that's where good people were, and you want your kids to be where good people are, right? And so as the clerk of session in this particular Presbyterian church, I was in a Bible study on the book of Genesis, and I waxed eloquently about the fact that I knew that Genesis was, especially chapters 1 through 11, was allegory. The pastors were there, most of the elders were there, many people were there, nobody said a thing. So I must have known what I was talking about, right? So as I was going out to the car to take my family home, this guy by the name of Jim Blunk came loping out to me. He says, JD, wait just a second. I said, sure, what do you want, Jim? He said, would you do me a favor? I said, what's that? He said, would you listen to this audio DVD on creation science? I said, sure, I'll humor you, Now, at that time, creation science, those words were sort of like an oxymoron to me. Creation science, you can't put those together, right? Well, so I slapped it, I don't remember, a day or two later, I slapped it into in my car, into my audio player, and it's one of those tape things, you remember those? And it didn't take long, I only had to listen to it once, and I'd say by the second time I listened to it, it was sort of like Paul on the road to Damascus. It was just a whole new world for me. And I was 40 years old at the time. Okay, so I thank God working through Jim to give me that one opportunity that I needed in order to see the truth. So from that time on, I really got into creation science, like a lot of people do. But the important thing was having gotten into creation science allowed me to accept Christ and be born again. I know maybe you've heard other guys tell you this, Some people will tell you, oh, people don't come to Christ through creation science. And I'll say some do. I know hundreds of them. I've met hundreds of people that have come to Christ through creation science because they could see that indeed God's word matches up to what they see out in the creation. So let's look at this topic of fossils. A lot of stuff that I'm not going to be talking to you about tonight is on my website, creationengineeringconcepts.org. You can get a complete biography there, and also I have cards and flyers out there by the tables that you can pick up. And please, if you have any interest in this topic, sign up for my Creation Engineering Concept News, which comes out monthly. And in that, there will be research and articles that I write on a monthly basis that should be of interest to people that have interest in these topics of creation engineering, creation science, biblical paleontology, worldview, and so forth. So I want to encourage you to do that at the very least. So let's look at living fossils. Charles Darwin coined this term, living fossils, and it was needed in order to describe living plants and animals that are unchanged in appearance from fossils that have been assigned as their fossil ancestor. So a fossilized plant or animal from a sedimentary layer of the earth that is also found alive is called a living fossil. So I know people have called their grandparents living fossils, but unless they came from out of the ground, that's not what we mean by a living fossil. You have to have been dug up. That's what fossil means. Fossilis is a Latin, it means dug up. So not all of us old people are actually fossils. Now, it's my experience that secular institutions do not generally promote the existence of living fossils. However, surprisingly, when I was, at least to me, it was surprising, when I went to the Smithsonian Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C., they did have a display of living fossils, about a dozen of them in a section there. And here's was the sign as you went into this little section of displays on living fossils. And they explained on this panel what living fossils were, and this is what the explanation was. Some lines of plants and animals may simply be conservative. That is, they may just evolve more slowly than others. So that was their description. Now, notice that in this definition of living fossil from a secular standpoint, that the evolution of life forms is assumed even if there is no evidence for it. So if a living fossil by definition is the same as something living today, then how can you talk about evolution? You know, there's no evolution to be seen. But nevertheless, they still talk about this as if evolution has taken place. And as we just saw in that short clip, that's a fact from ICR. Stephen Jay Gould, the late evolutionist who had a lot to say about fossils, here's this definition of stasis again. Stasis in the fossil record. Stasis, or he said, most species exhibit no directional change during their tenure on Earth. They appear in the fossil record much the same as when they disappear. Morphological change is usually limited and directionless. Gould also wrote this, quote, sudden appearance. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually by the steady transformation of its ancestors. It appears all at once and fully formed. So even with Gould, there is an assumption of macroevolutionary change, again, with little or no evidence for it. But he's stating the fact, and in the meanwhile believing in, he has a belief in evolution, even though he states facts which speak against his belief. So what we have is a summary of the reality, those two things plus two more. We have sudden appearance, we have stasis, we have a lack of transitions, and we have the range of presence expanding. And I'm going to talk about these a little bit more. We talked about sudden appearance of stasis, as did ICR. A range of presence expansion, what that means is, you know, when you first started back in the early 1800s digging up these fossils, you would find a certain kind of fossil at a certain layer in a certain area in the sedimentary layers, and then after 150, 200 years have gone by, you find that fossil above and below. Of course, that sort of screws up your whole idea of one thing changing into another, doesn't it? But that's another reality that we find in the fossil record, is that this range of presence continues to expand as we look more and more into the fossil in the rock record. And we can expect to find that with it could happen with most any fossil you can think of. And then the lack of transitions. In order for the fossil record to show macroevolutionary changes, there should be a myriad of true transitional forms. And this is me speaking now. There aren't any. There are none. There are quite a few things that are thought up and supposed and guessed about and written about, but if you actually get to really looking at them, I think it's clear that there aren't any. Here's the iconic evolutionary fairy tale that shows a transition of cell to fish to reptile, and then on from there all the way up to man. But that is what it is, a fairy tale. As the fossils are discovered in the rock record, we notice that they're often topsy-turvy, which is just another way of talking about these things, these other more technical terms. When I say topsy-turvy, that means things don't match up to the evolutionary expectations. The first kind of topsy-turvy fossil are fossils that are initially found lower in the rock record and assumed to be extinct. They're later found higher in the rock record, looking exactly the same, just as we saw in that picture from ICR, or that video. And then when they're found living, so they pop up and they're still living, that's where these topsy-turvy type fossils, number one, are living fossils again. Now, there's another type, that's when fossils initially found higher in the rock record, and they find them there and say, oh, we see this as some sort of a primitive fossil. Now we've got to look for something that it evolved into. They're making this assumption that it's primitive, but then later you find that, oh, the same thing's found lower. That sort of goofs up your whole idea about one thing slowly changing into something else. So the overall reality is that there's no indication in the rock record of evolutionary change, and nearly identical life forms are found throughout its entire extent. Okay, I could quit right here and go home and you could memorize this and you'd have learned what you need to learn tonight. But we need to talk a little bit more about this, so let's do that. From the Smithsonian display of about a dozen fossils, one could come out of the Smithsonian Natural History Museum and come to a conclusion that there's a very limited number of living fossils. We could assume that all the other animals and plants in the rock record demonstrate this macroevolutionary journey that the evolutionists believe exists. But no, that's not all. There are at least hundreds of other examples of living fossils. In fact, except for extinctions, it's easier to believe that examples of similarity in living and fossil life forms is the norm than it is to believe that these evolutionary fairy tales. So next we're going to consider some extensive research regarding living fossils from the sediments where dinosaur fossils have been found. In 2008, after many years of travel over the entire world, Dr. Carl Werner published this book, Living Fossils, Evolution of the Grand Experiment, Volume 2. And this book is an extensive book. It has findings concerning the living fossils and sedimentary rocks around the world, only where dinosaur bones have been found. He limited himself to looking at only sediments where dinosaur bones have been found. So he didn't look at all the rest of it. So if you look at this theoretical secular geologic time scale here, that's what we're looking at, you can see that we start at the top is the most recent times, down at the bottom is their idea of where everything started 4.5 billion years ago. And so what this does is this is the mental construct within which all evolutionary ideas are held with regard to fossils and rocks and so forth. Now please understand that I personally do not accept this evolutionary timescale because I see it as just a mental abstraction. And exists at one time when they first started out, creationists could have used this in order to try to explain the results of the worldwide flood. But it has become a part of the holy grail for evolutionists, and so that it's pretty tough to use it for that. The reason it exists is it's a mental abstraction. In order to exist, it exists to depict a philosophical idea. It does not represent science. But nevertheless, if we look at what Dr. Werner did when he was doing his work, between those two arrows is where he concentrated all of his research. In other words, just the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, the Mesozoic era. When he went throughout the world in all these museums, hundreds of museums and other sites where he was looking at these fossils, he would not look any place except in those areas where they defined that the fossil had come from one of these areas. So he's not looking at the whole thickness of the rock record. So that's important to know, that all the fossils we're going to look at out of this book are just from the time or those layers in which dinosaur fossils have been found. So in the study of living fossils and animal and plant extinctions, it is common for evolutionists to notice minor changes, just minor little differences in similar life forms, and then categorize them into entirely different species or genera. This you can reduce that down to the statement, scientists like to name things, okay? Scientists make their living naming things, all right? And scientists will admit this. Now that practice is in line with their belief that macroevolution and deep time are a fact. In 2008, after years of travel, as I mentioned, all over the world, Dr. Werner published this book. So let's look at some of his findings. In his book that we're talking about here, he provides us with powerful evidence that not only are there large variances within the same species, but there can even be large variation with the individuals of a species. This runs counter to the categorizing practices of evolutionists. And you're going to see that. I think you're going to be surprised at some of these things I'm going to show you, where you can see tremendous change in exactly the same species. I mean, not change, but just differences, okay? So one of the things that he found is that there exists a large variation within species and large variation within individuals of a species. Now this slide from Dr. Werner's book exhibits large variation within a species. So you're looking at two different dog skulls there. They're quite different. And of course, all of us understand a little bit about the breeding of dogs and how you can get all these different things. But what you need to know is that if I were a scientist with an evolutionary worldview and no one else had ever seen a dog before, and I dug up these two skulls from the rock record someplace, I would definitely assign them two different names, and they would probably be in different genera, if not different families. But we know today that those animals can reproduce and that they are the same species. There's a wolfhound at the top and a bulldog down below. They have to be considered the same species because they can interbreed. And here's another example of variation within the dog kind. It is easy to understand why evolutionists might tend to ascribe different species names to unfamiliar fossil animals and plants that may in fact be from the same species when all they have are the fossilized bone and tooth fragments to work with. There's large variation in horses as well, and we see large variation in things such as chickens. Now, here we are. Let's look at these oysters. Every one of these oysters are the same species dug up in the same location, and we know they can interbreed. Yet look at the tremendous amount of variation in size, shape, and appearance of these oysters. Here's another example. These leaves are all off the same tree, the same sassafras tree. Imagine if the sassafras was extinct and a secular paleontologist found these leaves as fossils apart from each other in the rock record. It would be likely that these leaves could be assigned to different species or genus categories. On the left is a fossil magnolia leaf, and this, again, keep in mind, from the dinosaur rocks. Everything we're going to look at is from dinosaur rocks. Magnolia leaf on the right is a modern one. They look to be almost identical in light of what we just learned about variation within a single life forms, you know, they're pretty close compared to those dogs and those other leaves we looked at. Yet the evolutionary mindset has caused these two to be placed in as different species. So when the arrows come up, they point at the species names, and it's hard to see that, but just take my word for it as we go through these. If there's an arrow pointing at it, it's going to be generally pointing at two different names for something that looks very much the same. All of these leaves shown here are from the same magnolia tree. Notice that the variation is greater than that seen in the comparison of the fossil and the modern magnolia leaf in the previous slide that has been assigned to different species. Now, the reason for this lack of common sense is that the fact that atheistic evolutionists cling to the philosophy of naturalism, and it's based on believing in a worldview that is counter to the Christian view. They have a set of presuppositions opposite to those of biblical creationists. And of course, if you're looking at the world through a telescope where you think death, blood, suffering, and disease are good things, and over millions of years that brings you man's existence, well, of course, you're going to see things differently. Primarily, here's the primary presuppositions of evolutionary paleontologists. Number one, there is no God, or God is irrelevant. Number two, everything came from nothing. Number three, all life forms evolved from common ancestors over billions of years. And number four, homology alone proves the evolution of all extinct and living life forms. And homology is that study where you look at the similarity of one animal to another animal. For example, humans have a hand, have 5 digits on their hand, as do monkeys, as do whales, as do a number of other animals. So that's what homology is. So now we're going to next look at some of Werner's living fossils, but I want to remind you first that Darwin coined the term living fossils to describe living plants and animals that are unchanged in appearance from fossils that have been assigned as their fossil ancestors. So again, a fossilized plant or animal from a sedimentary layer of the earth that is also found alive is called a living fossil. Now the first group we're going to look at are the echinoderms. I'm going to show you 18 different groups of animals and plants. And you can say, boy, that's going to be boring. But if I only showed you one or two, or if I just stopped right now, I don't think the impact would be there. It's sort of like, he said it, but I'm not going to believe it until I see it myself. So I think it's important for you to actually look at these 18 groups of life forms and see what Dr. Werner found just from the dinosaur sediments. So the echinoderms are animals with 5-sided symmetry in their body structure and include brittle stars, sea cucumbers, sea urchins, sea stars, and sea lilies. Now, evolutionists have assigned a different genus name. Now remember, you start down at subspecies as the smallest category of types of animals, and then you go to species, then you go to genus, then family, and then on up until you get to the whole big group, okay? So in this case, we're just talking about genus. These two look pretty much the same, but if you see here, they're entirely genus names. And you can say, well, why is that? Well, it's totally because of the assumption of evolution in millions of years. Crinoids, also called sea lilies, have 5-fold symmetry as well. They are going to have 5, 10, or 15 feeding arms. In this slide, we see remarkable similarity between the fossil and modern crinoids, even though they have been assigned to different genera because of the assumption of evolution and deep time. So that's group one. Now we'll look at group two, which are aquatic arthropod, and these have an outer armor called an exoskeleton. They have segmented bodies and jointed legs. Shrimp, lobsters, prawns, crayfish, and crabs are examples of aquatic arthropods. The modern lobster on the left looks much like the lobster on the right. And the fossil lobster on the right was found in the Solnhofen limestone of Germany, in which Archaeopteryx and many other famous fossils have been found. The secular timeline for the fossil on the right is 150 million years old. The modern and the fossil lobsters have been assigned different genus names because of the assumption of evolution in millions of years. Here's the aquatic arthropod horseshoe crab. And you'll see here, I want to point out something to you here, that above here we have, do you see my pointer up there? The little red? Okay. This is a fossil above here, and each one of these little spines has a number on it. And the reason they did that was because they wanted to show correlation, exact correlation to the living horseshoe crab here. Have exactly, you know, there's no difference really that you can tell with the evidence at hand that there's any difference between those, the fossil and the living. And why do they have different genus names? It's because of the assumption of evolution in millions of years. Next, we're going to look at group 3. These are land arthropod living fossils, similar to the ones we just looked at, except they live on the land. They have segmented bodies, exoskeletons, and jointed legs. Examples are insects, spiders, millipedes, and centipedes. Here we see a modern katydid in the top photo and a supposed 150 million-year-old katydid in the lower photo. There are many similarities, but they have different genus names because of the assumption of evolution in millions of years. Here we see examples of modern and fossil wood wasp and a modern and fossil beetle. The modern and the fossil look a lot alike, but have different genus name. Fourth group, bivalve shellfish, and these are they have two symmetrical shells and include such familiar varieties as scallops, oysters, clams, and mussels. Most everybody's heard of those or eaten them. Here we see a modern scallop above and a fossil scallop below. And again, they have put the numbers on each one of these ribs to show how identical they are with regard to that aspect of the design. Now, evolutionists believe that the fossil scallop is extinct and not related to the modern one. Of course, they have entirely different names, and so why would you come to that assumption that the bottom one is extinct when it's just like the one you dug out of the ground, you know, or out of the ocean side? Now, this slide shows a fossil clam above and a modern clam below with different genus names. Dr. Werner wrote that he thought these were so close to identical that they would have been able to reproduce. If so, they should have at least had the same species names. The assumption of evolution and deep time has resulted in different genus names on these as well. The fifth group is snails. Okay, we got snails are shellfish with a single coiled shell from the phylum Mollusca. With the previous life forms, we have looked at freshwater snails, just like we looked at before. And again, the ones above, or we'll go back to that. The ones below is a living, and the ones above are out of the Dinosaur National Monument in Utah, and they look very much the same. And here's the slit shell. Again, there doesn't seem to be much difference. However, they are in different genus categories due to the assumption of evolution in millions of years. Sixth group, remember there's 18 of these, so don't fall asleep. But I think it's important that you see how almost everywhere we look, we see these living fossils. Included in shellfish are the chambered nautilus, tusk shells, and sea cradles and lamp shells. The top specimen is a modern nautilus shell, and the lower is a fossil nautilus, supposedly millions of years old. These are identical in every respect, but because of the assumption of evolution and deep time, they have been assigned to different genus names. This slide compares the modern lamp shell above to the fossil lamp shell below. They look very similar again, but have different genus names. Again, he's only pulling these fossils out of the rocks where dinosaur fossils have been found. Group 7, worms, segmented worms. And here in his book, he shows pictures of fossil and a living. The fossil worm's from Australia. I don't know where he got the living one from. Number 8, group 8, sponge and coral. Sponges from phylum Porifera and corals from phylum Cnidaria. And here the fossil sponge above and below, they look pretty much the same, don't you think? And they're placed in entirely different genus names. The fossil coral above is, and the living coral is below, again, different genus names. Group 9, bony fish living fossils. The bony fish comprise the largest class of fish living today from phylum Chordata. Now, the modern coelacanth has the scientific name Latimer shalomni, and the fossil coelacanth is called Coelacanthus pencellatus. And of course, you can see those, so they have different genus and different species names, even though they're pretty much identical. I mean, so far, all we can tell, they're identical. Most of you have probably heard of the coelacanth because it may be the most famous living fossil that has ever been discovered. For those of you that haven't heard the story, I'll give you a quick background on it. The coelacanth, for many, many years, was thought to be the proof of seeing a fish grow legs. They looked at these fins and they said, we can see those fins growing into legs. All right, well, when in the 1930s, when they found them swimming around, they noticed that they were fins that were designed to help them swim, and no indication whatsoever they would be of any value for walking now or at any time in the future. So that was probably one of the most famous of the living fossils was the coelacanth. Now, in Dr. Werner's book, he provides evidence that the fossil in modern lungfish, gar, bowfin, paddlefish, eel, flounder, scad, roughy, milkfish, ladyfish, and sardine all look very similar. They look at the fossil, look at the living, they look almost the same. And so occasionally what you'll find, like 1 in 100 times, you'll find that they use the same genus name. In this case of the fossil herring, they do have the same genus name, but not the same species name. But at least we got to give them credit for allowing, in the case of the herring, showing some similarity in their minds as well. The 10th group is the cartilaginous fish. Cartilaginous fish have skeletons made of cartilage instead of bone and include the sharks and rays. The shovel-nosed ray on the left is the fossil specimen, and the modern is on the right. They look nearly the same, but they, as usual, are classified with different genus names. Dr. Werner found anatomical correspondence between the modern Port Jackson shark and a fossil shark only after he flipped the fossil shark upside down from the way it was displayed in the museum. So the point of that is the actual fish swam one way, but the paleontologists had it flipped upside down. Of course, then they wouldn't know that it was the same thing, or it was enough different that they didn't notice it. But he figured it out and said, oh, those two look the same if you just flip the fossil right side up. The assumption of evolution in deep time has resulted in these nearly identical modern and fossil shark teeth to be ascribed to sharks that have been placed in separate genera, as we've been speaking again, time after time. Next, group 11, amphibian living fossils. The two major types of amphibians living today are frogs and salamanders. Okay, I'm going to read, see this section up here where the big arrow is pointing? It's sort of hard for you to read. I'm going to read it to you. It says, he's talking about his wife, Dr. Werner's wife's name, Debbie. He said, Debbie and I toured some of the great dig sites of Europe on this project. On one trip, we traveled to Belgium, where the fossilized remains of 29 iguanodon dinosaurs were found. These dinosaurs were carefully removed and are now preserved under glass at a museum in Brussels. At this museum, we viewed the plants and animals found with these dinos, came across our first modern-appearing fossilized amphibian, and a salamander. So what he's showing you there is a picture on the right of a living salamander, and then he was able to find in this same area where they found these iguanodon dinosaurs, a fossil that looked pretty much like the living salamander. And here again, as we talk about these types of animals, these hellbenders are large carnivorous salamanders that live today in the streams of the Ozark and Appalachian mountain ranges. In this slide, we see that a modern hellbender skeleton above looks a lot like the supposedly extinct amphibian Cararis that is represented by the two lower fossils. Next, crocodile, crocodilian living. These are one of the 4 reptile groups living today. They consist of alligators, crocodiles, and gavials. Now, when I was at the Smithsonian Institute, what was interesting there is that they had a complete crocodile skeleton and a complete fossilized crocodile skeleton and they were identical in every respect that I could tell. I couldn't find a single thing different. They were exactly the same length. It was as if they had lived the same amount of years, and that they had to be both the same sex and everything. And I didn't show a picture here, but if you look at this picture, there's not much difference between those skulls. One of them is a skull of a recent alligator, and the other one is of a fossil. Gavials are reptiles that live today in Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Burma. Dr. Werner wrote, quote, "All three families of crocodilians living today, crocodiles, alligators, and gavials, have been found in dinosaur rock layers and appear basically unchanged," unquote. 13th group is the lizards. The four groups are the lizards, the crocodilians, the snakes, and the turtles. We're going to look at the lizards right now. Compare this modern ground lizard above to the Jurassic lizard from Germany below. Look carefully at the number of toes, the length of the toes, the length of the ribs, the width of the tail vertebrae. This is what I was talking about. When I saw those two crocodiles in the Smithsonian, it was like there was no difference at all. Yet one of them was millions and millions of years older than the other one, supposedly, and had evolved and evolved, you know. So, that's what I just read was that quote. And here's another quote. Dr. Werner says, "At Solnhofen in Germany, where the famous Archaeopteryx was found, along with a dinosaur, quarry workers also found this fossil lizard that, according to evolution scientists, looked very similar to a modern tuatara." Okay, well, when I was at the Smithsonian, that tuatara was one of the living fossils that the Smithsonian agreed to. 14th group is turtles, and this is the last type of modern reptile, and I have chosen just to show you this one example. There are all kinds of examples of turtles in his book that look pretty much the same no matter whether they're fossilized or living. And of course they have different genus names again. Why is that? Because of the assumption of evolution in millions of years. 15, mammals. There are three subclasses of mammals living today: placentals, pouched marsupials, and egg-laying monotremes. In the 20th century, maybe some of you are old enough to remember this, most paleontologists taught that mammals and dinosaurs did not live together because mammals had not yet evolved. Any of you remember that? And that there was an age of reptiles, and then to follow was an age of mammals. But with each passing year, more and more mammal fossils are being found with dinosaur fossils. Here are some of the smaller mammal fragments found in dinosaur layers in Dr. Werner's research. Some fossils of mammals as large as a bear have also been found in dinosaur layers, such as this bear-sized pantodont fossil found in Alberta, Canada. Now, most evolutionists are wedded to the asteroid theory that hypothesizes that only selected life forms, including the dinosaurs, were killed by a massive asteroid collision with the Earth some 65 million years ago. However, it makes little sense that only dinosaurs would have been affected by such a catastrophe if it had indeed happened. And secular museums do not regularly display birds with dinosaurs. In fact, they consistently show dinosaurs evolving into birds, right? Maybe some of you have heard that. This idea that dinosaurs evolved into birds, and some people say those birds are actually just evolved dinosaurs. Now, when Dr. Werner dug deep, he found that parrots, flamingos, cormorants, sandpipers, penguins, owls, avocets, albatross, ducks, and loons had been found in dinosaur layers. So if they're there, they couldn't have, how could they have evolved from dinosaurs if they're in there with the dinosaurs? It doesn't make much sense, does it? Now we're going to go from animals to plants. We're getting close, 16. Our 16th group is the cone-bearing plants. And there are three groups of cone-bearing plants living today, namely cone trees, palm-like cycads, and ginkgo trees. We will take a quick glance at just a few plant-living fossils that, as with the animals, are usually assigned to differing genus or species categories for the modern and the fossil due to the assumption of evolution in millions of years. With regard to this slide, this is what, maybe some of you heard of the Don redwood. That was supposed to be extinct. Then in 1941, a Chinese forester discovered a dawn redwood tree living, and that's what this quote up here has to talk about that. And so it's interesting too. I have a fossil of one of these from the John Day fossil beds out of Oregon, in the state that I live in. And of course, according to the evolutionists, millions and millions of years old, but it looks exactly like the one that's growing, you'll find it growing in the museum. Now, cycads are palm-like cone-bearing plants that grow in tropical and subtropical areas, and that's all he says up there. And again, you can see there's not much difference between the fossil and the living. And he says here that the Kunti is a small woody cycad native to Cuba and the Dominican Republic. Compare the modern Kunti branch above to this fossil cycad branch found in Jurassic fossil layers in France. Again, hard to see much difference with the amount of evidence that you have. And modern and fossil ginkgo trees are found with solid leaves and with split leaves. Now, Bonnie and I, we have a ginkgo tree in our backyard. Guess what it has? It grows both split and solid leaves right on that same. But in some secular theorists will be telling you how one evolved into the other one. But it's another case of where if you dig up something one place and make an assumption about something you dig up in some other place, you can come up with wrong ideas. Okay, the 17th we're looking at is the spore-forming plants. Plants that reproduce with spores include ferns and horsetails, moss and club moss. Here's an example of fossil fern leaf, which looks a lot like the modern black trunk tree fern. Dr. Werner found a number of other examples of ferns in the rock record that seem to have counterparts in the forests and gardens of today. Finally, we're going to look at flowering plants. Some evolutionists today say that the flowering plants did not exist at the time of the dinosaurs. You may have heard that. If you remember back in the days of when they said there was an age of reptiles and an age of mammals, there was a big mystery about how the dinosaurs could have gotten so big because the flowering plants hadn't evolved yet. But sad to say, they're wrong again, because there's plenty of evidence that there are flowering plants found right here in the dinosaur. Here we have the sweet gum, here we have the sassafras, poplar, walnut, bay leaf. All of these look pretty much the same, right? And they're found in with the dinosaur fossils. Here's a viburnum. Now, after all of his travels around the world and his compilation of hundreds of comparisons between modern life and fossil life forms, here are Dr. Werner's conclusions. Quote, "If I ignore the genus and species names and simply compare the fossils found in dinosaur rock layers to modern forms, I see a lack of significant change in all of the major animal phyla and all of the major plant divisions." He continues, quote, "My findings support the idea that animals and plants have not significantly changed, that is, evolved, over time, but simply some animals and plants have gone extinct while others have remained relatively unchanged," unquote. Those are his conclusions. Now, here's another creationist perspective by David Coppage that he put in his Creation Matters article, volume 16, number 4. He said, quote, "The living fossil evidence only makes sense without the millions of years. The living creatures resemble the fossil creatures because they are not separated by vast swaths of mythical time, but came from a created world with much more diversity than our impoverished remnant," unquote. So now we've thrown the evolution out the window, and I think we also have thrown millions of years out the window. And here's what you may remember that I said early on. I said, quote, "Except for extinctions, it's easier to believe that examples of similarity in living and fossil life forms is the norm than to believe the evolutionary fairy tales." Now, my latest book is this one with the title Fossils, Description and Interpretation Within a Biblical Worldview, which I'm going to give you a little bit of explanation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But you need to know that in this book, there are 70 examples of living fossils from my own collection that I have in my home museum. So we're going to do this shift of gears a little bit, just slightly, to look at how we should interpret fossils in general. And this part of my talk is designed to continue to demonstrate that the fossils in the rock record are strong evidences that support creation and the biblical historical record. The information I will be presenting today and much more can be found in this book, Fossils, Description, and Interpretation. Now, my presentation completely rejects the anti-Bible paradigm of evolution of millions of years that's presented by other fossil interpretation books today. All these books are from my library, but every one of them is designed as a book to help you identify and interpret fossils. They all assume evolution of millions of years. No one had made a book that was within a biblical worldview that interpreted fossils, the description and interpretation of them, until my book. So my book is the first one I'm aware of in the world that takes the place of these so that you can use it to help you identify fossils and also interpret fossils all within a biblical worldview, which means no millions of years, no evolution, worldwide flood, Genesis 1 through 11 historical narrative. Okay, so why do we need that? Well, it's because the mass media, all public schools and secular universities, as well as many Christian schools, most Christian seminaries and universities, all promote this evolutionary view with regard to fossils. So logically, if you believe what they are telling you, then that means the Bible has to be false, because the foundational ideas about why we need a Redeemer and so forth, and how death came about, all that is in Genesis 1 through 11. If we throw that out, then why would we need Christ? Because who's death was have been here for millions of years before man came along. So I thought it was really important for someone to come up with a book that would counter all of these descriptions and interpretations. And that's what I've done. So the source that I'm going to just run through this real quick. Here is what you're going to find in this book. How to interpret fossils. You're going to find fossil descriptions. You're going to learn about the rock record. You're going to learn about the global flood. And you're going to learn about the 18 facts of paleontology. Now, if you don't want to buy the book, at the very least, walk out of here with a free bookmark that has the 18 facts of paleontology on it. They're over there on the little black table. They're free. Just pick one up. And you can use that bookmark to remind you of the 18 facts of paleontology, all of them that will help you understand the truth with regard to paleontology. There are 4 major categories of fossils that are covered in the book. They are invertebrate animal fossils without a backbone, vertebrate animal fossils, those with a backbone, plant fossils, and trace fossils. And as I mentioned, the 18 facts of paleontology are sort of a theme that ties everything together in the book. So, for example, fact number 1, we're not going to go through all the stuff that's in the book, but I think you need to understand a little bit. Fact number 1 is that fossils are almost always formed by rapid and complete burial, like 99% of the time. And in the book, there are 137 instances where the fossil in a particular figure demonstrates the reality of this fact. Now, I'm just going to show you 6 examples of how you can understand this. So we'll look at this first one. So this is a Europolis fish from Lebanon, and this is one of the fossils in my museum. It's a figure 151 in my book. And what it is it's a fossil shown in the process of eating another eating another fish. And both of them are caught in an instant in time. So that would require rapid burial, wouldn't it? Here we have that's another type of fish. Exactly, there's more of these than you might realize. These instances where something that would have taken time was caught in an instant, and that couldn't be explained by long periods of time. You want to know, this picture is from the Houston Museum, and you might be interested to know the description of how this happened, the evolutionary description. This is the result, according to the secularists, of a fish choking on another fish, suffocating, slowly settling to the bottom of the water, and then being fossilized over many years. Does that sound like reality? That doesn't match up to anything with regard to our experience, does it? Here's a couple more. Figure 155. This is a fossilized remains of an exploded fish. Now, in certain circumstances, fish under duress and under certain conditions of temperature and pressure will actually explode. The herring fish they're found in the Green River Formation of Wyoming. You find a number of these like this. And again, they've been exploded, but you find all their gut, all of these hard parts, all in one little spot, caught in an instant in time. Okay, that's another example of fact number one. And then here we have a Coelophysis dinosaur, and in this case, the whole dinosaur was caught, and along with about 40 or 50 others, all in a big mass. In the case where the evolutionists say, that must have been a big flood. That's what they say. And I say, you're right, yeah. And here we have everybody, without a lot of effort, you can go somewhere in Washington, Oregon, and you can find these Catharinella-type fossil bivalve clams. And here's another similar one. This is what's called an Anodara bivalve clam. And these are found by hundreds and hundreds of thousands. And what's interesting about them is how many of them are found with the valve shut. Now, if you have ever been to the beach and walked on the beach and picked up clams, you find that normally when the clam dies, this thing pops open, right? Because it's dead. And it might even come into two pieces, right? That's how you usually find it. So we had to know that these things were buried rapidly. That's fact number one. Rapid burial, or else they wouldn't have been found, it wouldn't have been fossilized with their two valves together. Fact number two. Fact number two is that fossils are often found in assemblages, that is fossil graveyards, and in my book there's 74 instances of that. Fact number three, fossil assemblages indicate catastrophe, and in my book there's 75 instances of that. Fact number four, fossils are found in regions all over the earth, even on mountaintops. That's why you get one of those books or get one of the free bookmarks. 26 instances of that. Fact number five, 95%, almost all the fossils in the world are marine invertebrates. That is, animals without backbones. 62 instances of that in the book. You would expect that it might not be surprising that if there was a worldwide flood that you would find mostly marine invertebrates. Fact number six, the geologic timeline is a mental abstraction and it's not observable reality. And I'm one who really believes that to be true and that that's what the evidence says. But, and here's what I say in my book. I say, quote, the geologic timeline exists primarily as a result of deep time presuppositions and the philosophical need to support the anti-biblical idea of macroevolution. Even though no true scientific evidence exists that evolution is a fact, without the millions of years inherently supposed by the geologic timeline, macroevolution is not conceivable for even the most die-hard evolutionist. Fact number seven, sedimentary layers of the geologic column have been correlated mostly by fossils, 25 instances of that. Okay, what you need to know with regard to fact number seven, the geologic timeline was developed to its foundational form by the early 1800s. Sedimentary layers then and now are correlated to each other by the fossils found within the layers. Radiometric dating developed after the early 1900s cannot really support the fossil correlation because, number one, different radiometric methods do not come up with the same ages for the same rocks. Number two, rocks of known ages cannot be accurately measured using radiometric methods because they do not come up with the correct matching ages. Number three, if the radiometric assigned age does not match the geologically correlated age determined by fossil correlation, then the radiometric age is always thrown out. And four, it is standard policy that blind testing is not used for radiometric tests. If you're going to do a radiometric test, the first thing you ask you is how old is this? All right? So the result is that the fossils are the final determiner for the age of any sedimentary layer. Fossils are the king. Fossils win every time. Radiometric methods, sedimentary layer content, sedimentary layers and the thicknesses of the sedimentary layers are all things that they tried to use in the past in order to correlate one batch of rock with another batch of rock. All those things didn't work. The only thing works is fossils because you start out with the assumption that the fossils are telling you how old things are. You assigned them and you said if you see this fossil, then it's this old. If you find this fossil, it's older. If you find this fossil, it's younger. Of course it should match up because it's circular reasoning. It's what you started out with. But you need to know that if somebody tells you they know how old rock is, the only reason they know it is because somebody someplace correlated a fossil to it. You can always know that. Fact number 8, measurable variation with a kind of life form can occur quite rapidly. You saw that with living fossils, didn't you? 61 instances of that. Variation within a kind has not been and cannot be scientifically demonstrated to lead to evolution of one kind to another kind. 57 instances of that shown. Number 10, variation within a kind can be quite extensive but has definite limits. 57 instances of that. Number 11, biogenesis, which is the law that says life only comes from life, has never been observed to fail. Never. It's not a law. The first time they find that it fails, it's no longer a law. It's been it's been a law since Pasteur determined that that was a truth. 8 instances of that in all these fossils in my book. Number 12, all scientists, no matter their worldview, observe the exact same evidence. Their interpretations vary according to their accepted presuppositions. You can see that in 29 different fossils. Number 13, true transitional fossils have not been found, and there is no scientific reason to believe they exist. 30 instances of that. Number 14, no life form found living or fossilized today is primitive or simple. 98 instances of that. Number 15, there's little evidence that fossils are now being formed in lake beds, rivers, or oceans, which is where all the fossils, according to the evolutionists, were formed, in lake beds, rivers, or oceans, okay? But they're not being formed today. 52 instances of that. And then there's a side note here. You might be interested to hear this. Dr. Ron Neller, he's got a PhD in geomorphology. Fluvial, geomorphology, that has to do with flooding. He states, quote, 50-plus years of monitoring of rivers globally shows there's not enough sediment produced to create the large regional fossil beds that we see. There are many journal papers about sediment deposition from large floods today. They report only centimeters of sediment and only over local areas, but meters of sediments are needed over extensive areas to fossilize even a small animal. Now, so far as I've been able to tell, many of you have heard of the Missoula flood, right? Okay, that Missoula flood was from northern Idaho, went all through Washington and went up through the gorge between Washington and Oregon, where the Columbia River now runs. There were no fossils formed by the Missoula flood. As far as no one's ever come up with a fossil, all right? That was a big flood, but it was not the worldwide flood. Fossils are not generally formed by extensive river floods or tsunamis of today. If the uniformitarian story were really true, we should be buried in fossils formed just over the past couple of centuries alone. We should have to have bulldozers just to get to our house through all the fossils. All right? Fact number 16, the present is determined by the past, not vice versa, and uniformitarianism, the idea that the present is the key to the past, is an assumed principle of naturalism, not a scientific observation. And 23 instances of that. Fact number 16, again, we're talking about uniformitarianism. There are no fossil fuel layers being uniformly formed over the Earth's surface today so as to continue the building of the imaginary geologic column. While the new post-Lyell, and now Charles Lyell is sort of like the champion of uniformitarianism. He wrote his stuff in the early 1800s. Anyway, post-Lyell, the paradigm for geology is neocatastrophism. That is, a new idea of catastrophe. And that paradigm does not really match to the fundamental ideas of uniformitarianism that secularists must still, but however, they have to hang on to uniformitarianism because if they let loose of it, then they grab onto the worldwide flood. And they cannot grab onto the worldwide flood because that would wipe out all of their ideas that reject the Christian faith, okay? Would wipe out the millions of years they got to have. And might allow for some sort of life. They couldn't have any macroevolution if there aren't millions of years. Evolution and deep time are two sides of the same coin. And we're almost at the end here. Fact number 17. Fossil life forms are in many cases identical to or very similar to modern life forms. Have you ever heard anything about that before? That's what I've been talking about, living fossils. And fact number 18, ongoing variation with a kind often results in a reduction of future options for environmental adaptation for that kind. 13 instances of that. So that brings me close to the end here. Let's conclude. Here's some foundational ideas in the book. Most fossils are evidences of a single year-long cataclysmic event that took place on the earth some 4,500 years ago that we call the Genesis flood. Second, foundational idea. These fossils have great value today because they are a reminder of and proof of God's judgment, power, and grace. This is the biblical worldview, and it's true. Final foundational idea. Fossils are not evidences of many events over hundreds of millions of years that have value today because of their great age and their proof of macroevolution of life. This is a secular worldview, and it is untrue. Corollary 1, fossils verify the historical record in the Bible of a worldwide flood about 4,500 years ago. Corollary 2, fossils are reminders of God's perspective on and judgment of evil. That's an important corollary. Corollary 3, fossils are confirmations of God's actions of grace through the provision of Noah's Ark and the redemptive work of Jesus Christ on the cross. Ties it all together, doesn't it? Finally, I would like to tell you about the materials we have back on our table that you might be interested in. We do have a couple of Dr. Werner's books. We've got lots of other fossils and replicas and other books and DVDs on there, including this one. Now, if you want, I know you are live streaming this and so forth. I gave this talk over an hour and a half, which had a lot more information in it. If you want to hear more of this, grab this DVD that we have for sale. You can also get my book. This is the only creationist book available with extensive information on the history, geography, geology, and paleontology of the John Day fossil beds of Central Oregon. It's called Discovering the Animals of Ancient Oregon. And then I have my guidebook to North American dinosaurs according to created kinds. And then the coloring book for the kids, it's got the same sort of information in it. And that's the end. I thank you for your attention. I hope you have some questions.
Thank you, J.D. That's a lot of information to dump on us.
Well, I know it is, but when I started talking about living fossils before, and I would tell somebody, I went to Smithsonian and I saw 12 living fossils. That was just, big deal. But if you see that there are hardly any things living that don't have a living fossil, then it really nails you, I think. I would hope that it has more emphasis, more
Okay,
impact.
we'll take some time for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll come around with the microphone. And while you're thinking of these questions, we'll remind you we support this ministry by taking free will offerings. So if you care to contribute to the ministry, just as the men come around in a few minutes. And by the way, in the back table, we also now take contributions, and you can buy books and DVDs using credit cards. We haven't been able to do that for a while. We now have the equipment to do that. So, questions?
Yes, thank you. I was thinking as you were talking about this, the low general rate of sedimentation and so therefore the lack of burial of animals to create fossils. But when I think about what happened at Mount St. Helens, a great deal of material came down and buried, and there were sedimentary layers. And has there been any evidence of any fossilization of the animals that were caught in the explosion of Mount St. Helens?
Not that I'm aware of, but I'm open to continued input with regard to that. It's a lot of that area is off limits except to people that have the right credentials. You have to have permits to even go in there. I'm not aware of a lot of digging, where people are allowed to go in and dig, and so I haven't heard of any fossils being found there, but I could expect that there's a possibility that some might be at some point in the future, or that I'm not aware of them. That reminds me, how many of you have been to the Mount St. Helens Creation Center since it's been moved to downtown Castle Rock? If you haven't been there, put that on your list of things to do. Paul Taylor there has continued to improve. He now has his own building in downtown Castle Rock, so he doesn't have to rent. He was renting in the Grange Hall there for a while. And he's making a big impact so far as creationists, considering all we learned from the Mount St. Helens explosions and so forth.
Other questions you may have? Well, I guess you provided a lot. For
You
me
don't
to
even
think
have one,
about.
huh?
Pardon?
You don't even have one, huh?
I could think of one, but I want to give them a chance
Okay.
to ask
All right.
questions first. We got a few more minutes to take.
Okay, well, his
questions.
question is from a doctor. If you don't want to hear that, hurry up and come up with something.
Well, let me just add to what JD's been talking about here, and he may not have mentioned it, but finding the fossils, transitional fossils, was one of Darwin's big bugaboos. As I may have said here before, I considered Darwin he was an honest scientist. He wrote 2 chapters in his book saying, here are some potential problems with my theory. If I don't find evidence for them, my theory is bankrupt. Well, I think clearly the fossil record shows that his theory is bankrupt, and that's just one of them. There's a number of others.
A question for you. I appreciate what you did there. To look at something that they date millions of years ago, it looks like just today. To me, that's evidence against evolution. My question is, when you present that to the ones who have chosen to reject the truth and are from a secular worldview, what's their response? When you say the two are identical, why did you name them differently? What's their response?
Well, we talked about Dr. Stephen Gould. He's passed away now, but he was a very intelligent guy, and he's the one that came up with this idea of abrupt appearance and stasis. Remember, we talked about that? Well, he and another paleontologist by the name of Niles Eldridge got their heads together, and probably the idea they came up with is in general what is used in order to convince themselves that they still have a worldview that's worthy. And that's what is called punctuated equilibrium, basically, or some sort of instant monster in the past. So what they imagine is that over a short period of time, a period of time that is not possible to catch in the rock record, things evolved quickly, so that the fish developed its legs, boom, and changed its lung system and all that, boom, over a period of, let's say, to them, just a short period of 10,000 years. They like to say it only took 10,000 years, which is snap. If you're talking about hundreds of millions of years, 10,000 years isn't very long, right? So that's primarily how they convince themselves. But of course, if you think about it, that is a hypothesis based on absolutely no evidence whatsoever. That is just a dream, another one of what I call fairy tales.
Yes, what is your assessment of the intelligent design movement?
Well, my assessment of the intelligent design movement is that I look at it from the standpoint of a person who was lost and then found, and I don't think intelligent design alone would have allowed for me to come to Christ. So it has that weakness. Intelligent design people come up with a lot of work that's helpful to creationists and helpful to biblical believers and so forth, but they allow for the designer to be some unknown or most anything. Some guys that are strong into intelligent design are Christians, but for example, some of them believe in the fact that what we see in the design on Earth is there because of transplanted, what they call panspermia, where aliens from someplace else planted life on our Earth, and so, but that doesn't solve the problem. It just transfers it somewhere else, right? But that's the biggest problem I have with it is that it does not help identify the designer, the creation engineer of the universe. So that's basically my assessment.
I noticed that in Hebrews 11:6, there's 2 steps to coming to the Lord. You have to believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And I've always believed that the intelligent design people give us step one, and you cannot get to step two until you get there. So, like Dr. Stephen Meyer up at the Discovery Institute and some of these other people, it's been a blessing to me. So, yeah, there are some unbelievers there, but there are some unbelievers in our churches.
Yeah, well, Meyer, for example, he's a believer in millions of years, so that's why I have trouble with him. You know, so go ahead.
There is one young Earth scientist in that group, and that is Paul Nelson. I think you know. He is a young Earther, and he's part of the intelligent design movement. And you know, I appreciate the intelligent design movement, the scientists that work within that. But what's missing is not all of them identify who that designer is.
So people have sorted out how to make various gems, diamonds, etc., through using coal, etc. But has anybody experimented? Have you heard of any experimentation where people have actually tried to make fossils by burying animals and seeing what would happen? What processes would be required?
Well, that's going to have to take a two-part answer. That's a good question. So far as some sort of way of foundationally coming up with an artificial dinosaur bone, for example, like you can come up with an artificial diamond, I don't think that's possible. However, you can speed up the process by putting it with the right conditions of lots of minerals. For example, you can people have made fossilized hard hats or soft hats actually, but because they were poured mineralized water over the top of it. Also, inside you can have stalactites and stalagmites that will form over some sort of an animal in a cave, and it'll look like a fossil. But there wouldn't be any way that I could think of that you could come up with something by putting a bunch of elemental materials together and say, see there, I've got a dinosaur bone or I've got something else, because of the fact that it's you're asking for you to become a god to do it. I mean, because most dinosaur bones you can cut into them and you can see the cell structure and what have you in them. I don't know how you'd ever fake that. Now, when you look at amber, for example, a lot of people you've seen the insects in amber and so forth, and those are supposed to have been, depending on where you found the amber, millions of years old or whatever. My opinion on that is that since you can make those things today in the right conditions with trees, having the sap come out onto an insect and have exactly the same thing, I'm not so convinced that those amber fossils are, you know, in most cases I think they're not really truly old. You know, that's just my opinion, you know, my personal opinion.
So the reason I asked that question, I read an article recently about people having dead alligators where they put them in a tank and to see what would happen. Buried a couple dead alligators in a tank with water also, but they put some amount of sediment on them, etc., to try to verify the evolutionary viewpoint of how fossils form.
Yeah, and it didn't work, did it?
It didn't work.
Just repeat the question.
Oh, he just said that he had seen some experiments, especially with regard to, I think you said, alligators.
4 tanks and 8 alligators.
Yeah, where they tried to see if they could prove that fossils could be formed, you know, today by just in some sort of slow process. But it doesn't work. You can't do it.
Okay, another question.
Oh, have you heard that in South America, an evolutionist scientist found a fish that was so well preserved that he said it was formed in at least 5 hours, and the cause of death is actually fossilization?
I hadn't heard that specifically, but what I have heard is that now maybe you know we talked about the fact that fossils are found on the tops of mountains. which that matches up to our understanding of the worldwide flood, that the mountains rose up and the ocean beds dropped down and so forth. And so you would expect that mountains rising up would bring the fossils with them as they rose up over a period of time. Well, in some of those places like Bolivia in South America, when you find fossils, and actually lots of places I've heard about this, when you take the encased fish out of the fossil, it smells like a fish. It smells fishy. Okay, so that it would be an indication, like you said, that if it was a millions of years of process, you would think that odor would go away, right?
Okay, well, let's bring this to a close. Let's thank J.D. for the presentation and the Q&A. Thank you, J.D. Okay, just to wrap up, remember J.D. does have a number of books and DVDs that he produced there, and also there's some fossils and replicas of fossils, which I believe are for sale, some of them at least. Some others are to look at. And
Everything there is for sale.
okay. Okay, and just to remind you at the back table, we have books from the Apologetics Forum. There are some pamphlets there. There are a few things that are free. We have a booklet called Dealing with Dawkins. Dawkins is a UK atheist. He claims that God doesn't exist, of course, and he's written some books. He purports to show that evolution is true. And there's a believer, creation scientist, who has answered those claims of Dawkins, a little orange booklet. We've got quite a few of those. You're free to take one, but if you take one, you have to promise to read it and pass it on to somebody else. And the same thing is true with the Follow DVD from CMI, Creation Ministries International. That's in a little packet there on our table. Take one of those, 25 minutes. It explains why our youth are leaving the faith through this interview process. If you take one, promise to listen to the 25 minutes and then pass it on to somebody else. So we have, I mentioned some books with 50% off. We have quite a few new books there. And for those of you that missed having a look at Andy McIntosh's books when he was here last month, we still have, or we've acquired some new ones. We sold out all the ones we had, but there's some other ones on the table that we can make available. So with that, let me just close in a word of prayer, and then you'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you again for this time. We thank you for J.D. and his ministry, and for documenting that for us so that we can study that and see how that shows that evolution is not true. That's not how we got here. That is not consistent with your word. And we just thank him for doing that. Thank you for those that could come and listen on the live streaming as well. We pray that many would learn from that and be able to share what they've learned with others. We just thank you now for in Jesus' name. Amen.